All right. Early abolitionism. Obviously, the abolitionist movement was inspired in a big way by the Second Great Awakening, which was that religious moral crusade to bring about an end to slavery. It obviously inspired other religious movements, denominations, a revival in the Christian faith, reform for women, a movement toward temperance, etc. There are also other organizations, people that we need to look at for this movement. A lot of Quakers and Presbyterians were behind the abolitionist movement early on. One group in particular, a Presbyterian preacher by the name of Robert Finley, led a movement known as the American Colonization Society. This was an idea to relocate African American and Africans back to Africa. Which is a little weird and kind of ironic because the majority of those that were being sent back to this country or sent to this new country called Liberia, with the capital of Monrovia, they were African by descent, but they were American. They were born American. So this whole plan sort of fell apart as time went forward. It did gain some political support from Henry Clay, John Randolph, President James Monroe, hence the capital, Monrovia. But again, there's a stark division between North and South over this issue of abolition and emancipation. Do keep in mind that the Northern society is not what we would consider a monolithic society, meaning like not everybody north of the Mason and Dixon line wanted to free slaves, right? And not everybody in the South owned them. It's quite complex if you think about it. So really, if you look at the abolitionist era, it truly takes off in the Second Great Awakening. Guys like Charles Grandison Finney, the leading preacher of the era, authors and orators like Theodore Dwight Weld, who wrote the book American Slavery as It Is, Testimony of 1,000 Witnesses. His wife and her sister, Angelina and Sarah Gremke, two sisters born on a plantation near Charleston, South Carolina, that were disowned by their family for moving north to join the abolitionist movement. Harry Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin that we discussed before. Here we have Sarah Gremke on the left, Angelina Gremke, and her husband, Theodore Dwight Weld. You also have some pretty radical abolitionism at this period of time as well. Guys like William Lloyd Garrison, author of The Liberator, in his first edition in 1831, he says, "I am in earnest, I will not equivocate, I will not excuse, I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." A lot of people speculate, do copies of these abolitionist newspapers fall into the hands of slaves, even though this type of literature was banned in the South? And the answer to that question is yes. I mean, these newspapers and books were in circulation. Frederick Douglass, leading African American abolitionist, he is going to escape from slavery from Maryland, and he'll write his own slave narrative, but he will also publish the North Star. He actually has to flee the country for a while until he gains his freedom. Then he sets up shop for his newspaper in Rochester, New York. William Lloyd Garrison's operation was in Boston. This also inspires political party movements, the Liberty Party, the Free Soil Party. Ultimately, those party movements are absorbed into the Republican Party that will obviously run Abraham Lincoln as candidate for president in 1860. He's not the first Republican candidate, but he is one of the first. He's only the second Republican candidate to run in a presidential election. So here we have William Lloyd Garrison. He was beaten in the streets of Boston for his beliefs, and that's a copy of the Liberator. Frederick Douglass, one of his copies of the North Star. I'm pretty sure, I think that's the actual first edition of the Liberator right there. The South had its own propaganda campaign, and obviously banned books like Uncle Tom's Cabin and newspapers like the Liberator and the North Star. But they also had a campaign where they try to portray the peculiar institution, as they called it, the institution of slavery, as a happy one, with family units and the slave South being these slaves being taken care of in a paternal system and being cared for better than Northern free labor. Well, as we know, Northern free labor was tough going, right? A lot of the labor force was made up of young men and women who didn't necessarily have a whole lot of rights, but they weren't property, right? And this particular piece of Southern propaganda is false in on a number of different levels. Number one, this is not common leisure, right? Typically, slaves in the American South would have worked 6, sometimes 7 days a week. Another thing here that's problematic is a family unit spending time together. Family units did spend time together, but family units were not recognized. And one piece of like real degradation and despair for the Southern slave was that his family could be broken up, or her family could be broken up at any time. So there's a significant abolitionist impact in the North. You have the extreme Garrisonians, and just like any movement, there are different splinter groups that come out of it. There are obviously different leaders that come out of it. So this leads to a group called the Anti-Slavery Society. They pop up in northern states. One of their key leaders was Wendell Phillips. He is known as the golden trumpet of the abolitionist cause. He refused to wear cotton and eat sugar cane because it was produced by slaves in the American South. Harriet Tubman, she too escaped slavery from Maryland, and she will become a conductor on the Underground Railroad, the system of network of safe houses to help free slaves. She makes 19 different trips to free slaves, and later becomes not only promotes the suffragist cause for women's right to vote, but also becomes a Union spy during the American Civil War. She is known as the Moses of her cause. Henry the Box Brown, interesting story about this gentleman. He was a skilled artisan, so skilled that he had purchased the freedom of his entire family, but he himself was unable to buy his own freedom because he was actually bringing profits in for his owner, and obviously enough profits in for himself that he was able to purchase his family's freedom. Therefore, he decided to ship himself to freedom to Philadelphia to a group of abolitionists. Do keep in mind that the South was in a great deal of debt to the North. Most Southern debt was owed to Northern banks. There are other abolitionists that become martyrs during this era. Lewis Tappan, his house was destroyed as a result of his defense of the Amistad slaves. Anybody heard of Amistad before? This was a ship crossing the Atlantic carrying a group of slaves. What do we already know about that particular law? Very good. International slave trade's abolished by now. You're not allowed to trade slaves internationally. So this particular case goes to the court, and Tappan supports these slaves on the Amistad and supported their freedom. Furthermore, he was an abolitionist. William Lloyd Garrison, as I mentioned, was beaten in the streets of Boston. One of the earliest martyrs of the era was Elijah P. Lovejoy. Do I have any Simpsons fans in here? Okay, a little bit. Reverend Lovejoy of the Simpsons is named for this particular reverend. He produced a anti-slavery newspaper in a warehouse in Alton, Illinois, and his printing press was destroyed, thrown into the Mississippi River, and he was killed by a mob in 1837, making him one of the earliest abolitionist martyrs of the cause. Here we have Wendell Phillips, Lewis Tappan, Elijah P. Lovejoy, Harriet Tubman, and there's Henry the Box Brown. Anybody ever been down to the Canal Walk? You seen the monument for Henry the Box Brown? Yeah, it's kind of crazy. Yeah. Yeah, and they flipped him over upside down. Luckily, somebody flipped him back because it said this side up, you know, and somebody flipped it back over. This event also creates a big problem because guys like William Lloyd Garrison said, let's throw this at everybody's face and let them see that we freed this guy. And guys like Frederick Douglass are like, no, don't publicize it, because if you publicize it, every box in every Southern port will be checked for a slave. If you don't publicize it, maybe 1, 2, 20 more slaves will be free as a result of this strategy. So this is another way in which you start to see the movement kind of go in different directions. Do keep in mind, the free state, slave state balance is a constant struggle. And this struggle is as early as the Louisiana Purchase, because by the time Louisiana decides to enter as a state, they're going to want to enter as a what type of state? Slave. So then this begs the question, what do you do with the rest of the territory? A congressman by the name of Talmadge came up with the idea, let's create an amendment to slavery in new territories. And this ultimately got shot down. A bill requesting that the territory of Missouri be admitted to the Union as a free state. So this leads to a little bit of a conflict. And the conflict is over the free state, slave state balance. In comes the great compromiser, Henry Clay of Kentucky, who says, all right, to keep the balance, we'll allow Missouri to enter as a slave state, Maine, which had previously been part of Massachusetts, will enter as a free state, and all of the territory north of the 36-degree parallel line, with the exception of Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri, will become free territory, and everything to the south will become slave. So if you take a look at the map, here's the 36-degree parallel. All that will become free. All of this will become slave. What you need to realize is that Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, California, the Oregon Territory, all of that is either still in dispute or has not been apprehended by the U.S. yet. So once the Oregon Treaty is settled, once Texas enters as a slave state, and once the Mexican War comes to an end, between 1845 and 1850, in that 5-year span, there's a lot of questions. What are we going to do with all this new land? Is it going to become slave? Is it going to become free? Yet again, we have another congressman. This guy is David Wilmot from Pennsylvania, who says, let's not allow any slavery in the new territory gained from the Mexican War. This makes it through the House a couple of times, but it's blocked by the Senate. So this becomes the compromise of 1850. Yet again, Henry Clay, part of the Missouri Compromise, part of the nullification crisis, this will be his final compromise. He'll be he and the rest of the triumvirate will die within a year or two following this compromise. This will be the last compromise they broker. They also bring a young senator on the scene with them, senator from Illinois, Stephen Douglas, aka the Little Giant. Here are the stipulations of the Compromise of 1850. California enters as a free state, popular sovereignty in Utah and New Mexico territory, formal border between New Mexico and Texas, the slave trade, but not slavery, will be banned in D.C., and then the most controversial part of the act, or compromise, the Fugitive Slave Act, which allows for slaves to be apprehended by bounty hunters and returned to the American South into the institution of slavery. To make it even more controversial and racist, judges made $5 to free slaves and $10 to send them back to the South. When all of this first came across the president's desk, Zachary Taylor vetoed the compromise. But we already know he doesn't live too much longer after that. He dies of cholera in office. His vice president, Millard Fillmore, will sign it into law, and it becomes a very controversial compromise. So here we have Henry Clay, the great compromiser. We also have the map that shows California as a free state, popular sovereignty in the Utah territory, popular sovereignty in the New Mexico territory. This is a broadside or poster warning free African Americans in Boston that bounty hunters are coming around. And a lot of people were actually captured and they were free and their papers were destroyed because they were trying to make money. And then this is a sketch of a runaway slave in a newspaper. Looks like it's probably Harper's Weekly. Really famous publication from that era. All right, that leads us to the Little Giant's next compromise. That's the Little Giant over there, Stephen Douglas. And this compromise is the Kansas and Nebraska Act. He is from Illinois. He wants to see Chicago become the location where the Transcontinental Railroad will stretch to California. That was one of the stipulations of California becoming a state. California had previously been its own little country for a couple of years. The stipulation of becoming a state was they needed a transcontinental railroad. With that being said, Stephen Douglas concocts this plan to do away with the Missouri Compromise and allow for popular sovereignty in all of the territory in Nebraska and Kansas. Kansas and Nebraska territory is massive. We're going to take a look at that on the map here momentarily. So people react to this law being passed. It goes through Congress, and the president, Franklin Pierce, reluctantly signs it into law, and it leads to a violent border war because everybody that is pro-slavery and everybody that is anti-slavery flood into Kansas to vote for what they want. We call the pro-slavery folks border ruffians. We call the free anti-slavery folks jayhawkers. They show up to the ballot box with knives, swords, pistols, shotguns, and muzzle loaders, ready to go battle. And they do. What occurs is the events of Bleeding Kansas. This is leads to the death of 200 civilians. One of the most famous people that comes out of the Bleeding Kansas event is an abolitionist by the name of John Brown. John Brown and several of his sons bash in the heads of 5 pro-slavery supporters on Pottawatomie Creek, where the creek runs red with blood. It's called the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre. John Brown is going to go on to lead an even larger rebellion closer to the start of the American Civil War. Question? Yeah, sure. I can do that for you. All right. So, Bleeding Kansas has a decent impact on the election of 1856. The election is going to be between the first Republican candidate, the Pathfinder, John C. Fremont, who had become famous for mapping out the Oregon Trail, fighting in the Mexican War, and leading the California Bear Republic. But he was also an outspoken abolitionist. On the Democratic ticket was a Northern Democrat who was a Southern sympathizer by the name of James Buchanan, who believed in the state's rights to practice slavery. He'll win the election, and he's another one of the lame ducks. He does very little to prevent the American Civil War from unfolding after the election of Abraham Lincoln. There's another event that occurs that no one really does anything about, but it leads to some serious violence and some real tension in Congress, and that is the Crimes Against Kansas speech. Charles Sumner, Massachusetts senator, gave the Crimes Against Kansas speech speaking out against the Bleeding Kansas events, and he called out a South Carolinian who was a slaveholder and member of Congress by the name of Andrew Butler. Butler was not there to defend himself, but since he had disgraced the honor of Butler, he so had disgraced the honor of Butler's cousin, Preston Brooks. Brooks marches down to the Senate floor and beats Sumner within an inch of his life with his cane. I mean, beat him so bad that it took him 3 years to recover. He almost died from beating. In response, Southerners send Preston Brooks canes in celebration of the beating. In response, in the House and the Senate, people start coming to the chambers in the House and the Senate armed with knives, pistols, and weapons, ready to do battle in the House and the Senate. Remember your ideas behind secession: John C. Calhoun and the nullification crisis, the idea that the tariff of abominations was sort of almost led to the secession of South Carolina. This is one of those theories that gives the states the idea that they have the right to secede if they want. The Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott was a slave born in Southampton County, Virginia. He is sold into slavery in Missouri. But he and his owner had lived in free Illinois and Wisconsin territory. Therefore, after his owner's death, rather than him being inherited to his owner's child, he decided to take it to the courts and say, I'm a free man. I lived in free territory. The courts make a groundbreaking decision here. They say, sorry, Dred Scott, you're a slave, you're not a U.S. citizen, you're not gaining your freedom, and there is no free or slave territory recognized by the federal government. This sends shockwaves through the country, and the Dred Scott decision is taking us one step closer to civil war. The Lincoln-Douglas debates were the Illinois Senate race that was all about the issue of popular sovereignty. Lincoln is saying the nation can't remain half slave, half free. We can't remain divided. He doesn't believe that slavery should spread to the West. Stephen Douglas is all about popular sovereignty. He's saying, let the people decide and vote whether they want slavery or not. So he runs on the popular sovereignty campaign. Lincoln loses this election, but the popular sovereignty issue ultimately divides the Democratic Party, and it's going to open up the door for Lincoln to actually win the election of 1860. John Brown, same guy that bashed in the heads of the pro-slavery folk at Pottawatomie Creek, has a premonition from God that he, much like Nat Turner, must end slavery through violence and must do so by arming other slaves. His plan: raid the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia. It's a town and an arsenal that sits on the convergence of two rivers, the Shenandoah and the Potomac. John Brown and his followers, who were not as many as he thought he would have, raided the arsenal, and from the get-go, things went horribly wrong. The first person they actually kill is a free African American. That actually gets them a bit rattled. They get held in there, they take hostages, and they fall back into the firehouse. The place is surrounded, and by rail, Colonel Robert E. Lee and Major Jeb Stuart are going to lead 200 Marines. They're not Confederates yet. They're U.S. Army and Cavalry, are going to bring 200 Marines by rail to take out John Brown and his followers. Brown will be wounded, he'll be arrested, he'll confess, and then the governor of Virginia, Governor Wise, is going to order he be on trial. He goes on trial and is convicted and will be executed in Charlestown, now West Virginia, then Virginia. This is a very interesting event. There's John Brown on the left. There he is with his beard there on the right as he's heading to the gallows. Cadets from the Virginia Military Institute are marched from Lexington to Charlestown and led by their professor of physics and artillery, Thomas J. Jackson, to guard John Brown. One of the guards in the meantime is a militia guard who is a militiaman by sort of hobby and an actor by trade. His name, John Wilkes Booth. So there's a lot of interesting people in attendance at John Brown's execution. Herman Melville will call John Brown the meteor of the Civil War. Any Melville fans up there? All right. The election of 1860, and I want everybody to focus on this. This is the final event that leads to the American Civil War, leads to the secession of South Carolina. There are four candidates. Lincoln is the Republican candidate. He was nominated on the third ballot. A very interesting nomination. It occurred in Chicago. Lincoln is born in Kentucky but lives in Illinois. He's from Springfield. They sold all these counterfeit tickets to the convention. He's nominated at the convention. There's much excitement, much ballyhoo. People are boozing it up, having a good time. It's a huge party for Lincoln's nomination. A new party that was formerly made up of what we would call cotton Whigs is known as the Constitutional Union Party. They were headed up by a really famous guy that we're going to learn a little bit about later. His name's Alexander Stephens. He'll become the vice president of the Confederate States. Their candidate is John Bell, Tennessee. But the Democrats have now divided into two factions. The Northern Democrats absorbed some of the Whig Party. They're all about popular sovereignty. And the Southern Democrats absorbed some of the Cotton Whigs, and they are all about slavery existing where it is and spreading where it can. They were some of those folks that were behind the Ostend Manifesto to try to purchase Cuba from Spain, even though it wasn't for sale. So in this election, Lincoln isn't even on most of the southern states' ballots, but he will easily win the Electoral College and will be named the 16th President of the United States. Before he can even go to his inauguration, South Carolina will secede on December 20th, 1861. By March, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas will follow. By April and May, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. There will be a set of border states, though, that practice slavery, but they did not go. Missouri, Kentucky, a new state, West Virginia, that secedes from Virginia in 61 and becomes officially a state in 1863, and Maryland and Delaware. All right? So the Union is dissolved, Lincoln is president, and that is going to take us into the American Civil War.